1700s and 1800s Yorkshire at Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is narrated by Nellie Dean, the maid, and Lockwood, the tenant farmer.
The main characters are split into two neighborhoods, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. In Wuthering Heights, there are three main characters, Hindley, Earnshaw, Catherine Earnshaw, and Heathcliff. At Thrushcross Grange, there are two main characters, Edgar Linton and Isabella Linton. These main characters in total have three children, Linton Earnshaw, Hareton Earnshaw, and young Catherine Linton. The story begins with Lockwood, a new tenant farmer on Thrushcross Grange. In 1801, Lockwood writes in his diary about visiting the landlord, Mr. Heathcliff, at Wuthering Heights. Staying for the night, Lockwood finds a diary from Catherine Linton and sees a ghostly figure crying the name Catherine Linton, demanding to come into the room. Lockwood slits the ghost's wrists on shards of glass from the window until she broke free. After Lockwood returns to his own house, he talks to Nellie Dean, his housekeeper of the past at Wuthering Heights. In 1767, Mr. Earnshaw, the landlord of Wuthering Heights, adopted Heathcliff and made him a part of his family along with the other two children, Catherine and Hindley. The siblings hated him at first, but Catherine became close and fell in love with Heathcliff. After Mr. Earnshaw's death in 1777, Hindley and his wife Frances took over the house and tortured Heathcliff. One day, while Heathcliff and Catherine were out teasing Edgar and Isabella Linton of Thrushcross Grange, Catherine gets injured and stays at the Grange until she was fully recovered. There, Catherine was completely transformed into a lady with manners and royalty. After she returns to Wuthering Heights, Catherine considered Heathcliff as lowly and a servant and told him to go away. Heathcliff tells Nellie that he will seek revenge on all the Lintons and Earnshaws. At the summer of 1778, Frances dies from giving birth to Hareton, causing Hindley to become alcoholic. At 1780, Edgar Linton proposed to Catherine, and because of his wealthy social status, Catherine marries Edgar. Angrily, Heathcliff leaves Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff returns to Wuthering Heights in 1783, polished and gentlemanly. Hindley becomes madly in love with Heathcliff's fortune and plans on killing him. The pregnant Catherine and Isabella continually visit Wuthering Heights, and Isabella falls madly in love with Heathcliff. Realizing Heathcliff's crazy addiction for torture, Isabella leaves in 1785 and moves to London and eventually gives birth to Linton, Heathcliff's son. In 1784, Catherine becomes gravely ill and dies after giving birth to young Catherine prematurely. Heathcliff curses Catherine for the pain she has caused him and asks for her spirit to haunt him. In 1785, Hindley dies 6 months after Catherine's death. Heathcliff now owned Wuthering Heights and Hareton. Hareton is treated like a servant. In the meantime, young Catherine grows up isolated in Thrushcross Grange with her father. Edgar warns her to never visit Wuthering Heights or anywhere nearby. One day, on her father's trip to London to visit her ill aunt Isabella, young Catherine visits Wuthering Heights, instantly liking the new friend Hareton. Edgar returns to the Grange with Linton since Isabella died, and Nellie sends him to Wuthering Heights. Ever since his arrival at Wuthering Heights, Linton has always been very sick because his father treated him cruelly. At age 16, young Catherine meets Heathcliff and Hareton. Heathcliff tells her that one day he wants young Catherine and Linton to get married. Young Catherine becomes interested in her cousin and leaves that night to be with Linton secretly. Slowly dying from illness in 1801, Edgar eventually agrees to young Catherine's marriage with Linton. After Edgar's death, Thrushcross Grange belonged to Linton and Heathcliff. Heathcliff treats both Catherine and Linton cruelly, while Nellie is ordered to remain at Thrushcross Grange. Shortly, Linton dies. After his long conversations with Nellie of Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights past, Lockwood decides to quit his tenancy at Thrushcross Grange. In 1802, Nellie returns to work at Wuthering Heights. Catherine treats Hareton cruelly because she thinks of him as an illiterate servant. However, they slowly fall in love after Catherine patiently teaches Hareton how to read. In the meantime, Heathcliff tells Nellie that he no longer seeks revenge on young Catherine and Hareton because he sees so many resemblances and reminders of the dead Catherine. Soon after, Heathcliff continuously talks to a ghost that he claims is Catherine and dies shortly afterward. Then in 1803, Hareton and Catherine gets married, living happily ever after. There are 5 main important themes within the novel. The first one is revenge, love, supernatural, social class, and betrayal. So the first one is revenge. After Catherine decides to marry Edgar despite acknowledging that she loves Heathcliff even more, Heathcliff decides to seek revenge on all the Earnshaws and Lintons, even including their children. After the children grew up, he saw the resemblances of Catherine, so he stopped seeking revenge. The second one is love defeats all evilness and hatred. There were many different pairs of people who were in love. The first one is Catherine and Heathcliff, Catherine and Edgar, young Catherine and Linton, and young Catherine and Hareton. So the most important one would probably be Catherine and Heathcliff and young Catherine and Hareton, because young Catherine and Hareton hated each other at first. However, the story ends with how they were going to get married after a couple years. The third one is supernatural exists and haunts people. So within the novel, Lockwood begins writing in his diary about visiting Wuthering Heights, and it starts off with meeting Catherine's ghost and how she wanted to come into the house. This begins the supernatural concept. Throughout the novel, after Catherine dies, Heathcliff requests for the ghost to haunt him and even talks to the ghost before he dies. The fourth one is social class. Social class restrains the characters from living the life they had desired to. For the first one, it would be Catherine, because Catherine wanted to marry Heathcliff. However, because of his lower social status, Catherine decides to marry Edgar instead. Within the story, Heathcliff was always treated as a servant after Mr. Earnshaw died. Hareton was also treated as a servant since Heathcliff wanted to seek revenge on the family, so Hareton was treated as a slave. The last one is betrayal. Betrayal leads to hatred and revenge. After Catherine decides to marry Edgar, Heathcliff was betrayed by Catherine, so Heathcliff decides to seek revenge on the whole entire family line. Wuthering Heights corresponds to the dark version of Rags to Riches, with Heathcliff as the main character. At the beginning, Heathcliff is portrayed as the victim or the hero, while he is abused by his siblings or disliked by Hindley and Catherine. However, the central crisis, which is Catherine deciding to marry Edgar, causes Heathcliff to change from the hero into the villain, because Heathcliff decides to seek revenge on the Earnshaws and the Linton. For the first step, it's initial wretchedness. So Heathcliff is presented as an orphan who is brought in by Mr. Earnshaw and disliked by the other characters, Hindley and Catherine, who are presented as the dark figures at the beginning of the story. Catherine transitions from being the villain to the princess, or the person that Heathcliff falls in love with. However, Hindley, he remains to be the villain throughout the story until he dies. So the second step is initial success, which is also the first encounter with the princess. Heathcliff and Catherine begins to fall in love at this moment. So the third step is the central crisis. So the central crisis begins when Catherine decides to marry Edgar instead of marrying Heathcliff, even though she loves Heathcliff even more. And it's also the time when Mr. Earnshaw dies, because after that, Hindley takes over the family and he tortures Heathcliff and abuses him. The fourth step is independence and final ordeal. After Catherine decides to marry Edgar, Heathcliff leaves and returns after a few years with wealth, power, and revenge. He takes in all three of the children, Linton, Hareton, and young Catherine, and he tortures them. However, he eventually gives up and dies. So the fifth step is final union. After Heathcliff dies, his ghost reunites with Catherine's ghost, which is a happy ending towards their love story. And for young Catherine and Hareton, since Hareton is illiterate, young Catherine patiently teaches him how to read, and slowly they gradually fall in love. At the end, Nellie Dean tells us, the readers, that they will be married after a few years later.